Relief of the sea floor. Anthropo-geography has to do primarily with the forms and relief of the land. The relief of the sea floor influences man only indirectly. It does this by affecting the forms of the coast, by contributing to the action of tides and scouring out river estuaries, as on the flat beaches of Holland and England, by determining conditions for the abundant littoral life of the sea, the fisheries of the continental shelf, which are factors in the food quest and the distribution of settlements. Moreover, the ocean floor enters into the problem of laying telegraph cables, and thereby assumes a certain commercial and political importance. The name of the telegraph plateau of the North Atlantic, crossed by 3 cables, points to the relation between these and submarine relief. So also does the erratic path of the cable from southwestern Australia to South Africa via Keeling Island and Mauritius. Submarine reliefs have yet greater significance in their relation to the distribution of the human race over the whole Earth, for what is now a shallow sea may in geologically recent times have been dry land, on which primitive man crossed from continent to continent. It is vital to the theory of the Asiatic origin of the American Indian that in Miocene times a land bridge spanned the present shallows of Bering Sea. Hence the slight depth of this basin has the same biogeographical significance as that of the British Seas, the waters of the Malay Archipelago, and the Melanesian submarine platform. The impressive fact about Wallace's Line is the depth of the narrow channel which it follows through Lombok and Makassar Straits and which, in recent geological times, defined the southeastern shore of Asia. In all these questions of former land connection, anthropogeography follows the lead of biogeography, whose deductions, based upon the dispersal of countless plant and animal forms, point to the paths of human distribution. Mean elevations of the continents. The mean elevation of the continents above sea level indicates the average life conditions of their populations as dependent upon relief. The 1,010 meters, 3,313 feet, of Asia indicate its predominant highland character. The 330 meters, 1,080 feet, representing the average height of Europe, and the 310 meters, 1,016 feet, of Australia indicate the preponderance of lowlands. Nevertheless, anthropogeography rarely lends itself to a mathematical statement of physical conditions. Such a statement only obscures the facts. The 660 meters, 2,164 feet, mean elevation of Africa indicates a relief higher than Europe, but gives no hint of the plateau character of the dark continent, in which lowlands and mountains are practically negligible features, while the almost identical figure, 650 meters or 2,133 feet, for both North and South America is the average derived from extensive lowlands in close juxtaposition to high plateaus capped by lofty mountain ranges. Such mathematical generalizations indicate the general mass of the continental upheaval, but not the way this mass is divided into low and high reliefs. 1026. The method of anthropogeography is essentially analytical, and therefore finds little use for general orometric statements, which may be valuable to the science of geomorphology with its radically different standpoint. For instance, geomorphology may calculate from all the dips and gaps in the crest of a mountain range the average height of its passes. Anthropogeography, on the other hand, distinguishes between the various passes according as they open lines of greater or less resistance to the historical movement across the mountain barriers. It finds that one deep breach in the mountain wall, like the Mohawk Depression 1027 and Cumberland Gap in the Appalachian System, 1028 Truckee Pass in the Sierra Nevada 1029 and the Brenner in the Alps 1030 has more far-reaching and persistent historical consequences than a dozen highlight passes that only notch the crest. Pack trail, road and railroad seek the former, avoid the latter, one draws from a wide radius, while the other serves a restricted local need. Therefore anthropogeography, instead of clumping the passes, sorts them out, and notes different relations in each. Distribution of reliefs. In continents and countries, the anthropogeographer looks to see not what reliefs are present, but how they are distributed, whether highlands and lowlands appear in unbroken masses as in Asia, or alternate in close succession as in Western Europe, whether the transition from one to the other is abrupt as in Western South America, or gradual as in the United States. A simple and massive land structure lends the same trait of the simple and massive to every kind of historical movement, because it collects the people into large groups and starts them moving in broad streams, as it were. This fact explains the historical preponderance of lowland peoples and especially of steppe nomads over the small, scattered groups inhabiting isolated mountain valleys. The island of Great Britain illustrates the same principle on a small scale in the turbid, dismembered history of independent Scotland, with its Highlanders and Lowlanders, its tribes and clans separated by mountains, gorges, straits, and fjords. 1031 in contrast to the smoother, unified course of history in the more uniform England. Carl Ritter compares the dull uniformity of historical development and relief in Africa with the variegated assemblage of highlands and lowlands, nations and peoples, primitive societies and civilized states in the more stimulating environment of Asia. 1032. Homologous relief and homologous histories. The chief features of mountain relief reappear on a large scale in the continents, which are simply big areas of upheaval lifted above sea level. The continents show therefore homologous regions of lowlands, uplands, plateaus and mountains, each district sustaining definite relations to the natural terrace above or below it, and displaying a history corresponding to that of its counterpart in some distant part of the world, due to a similarity of relations. This appears first in a specialization of products in each tier and hence in more or less economic interdependence, especially where civilization is advanced. The tendency of conquest to unite such obviously complementary districts is persistent. Hence the central highland of Asia is fringed with low peripheral lands like Manchuria, China, India and Mesopotamia, into whose history it has repeatedly entered as a disturbing force. All the narrow Pacific districts of the Americas from Alaska to Patagonia are separated by the Cordilleras from the lowlands on the Atlantic face of the continents. All reveal in their history the common handicap arising from an overwhelming preponderance of plateau and mountain and a paucity of lowlands. Colombia, Ecuador and Peru have in the past century been stretching out their hands eastward to grasp sections of the bordering Amazon lowlands, where today is the world's great field of conflicting boundary claims. Chile would follow its geographical destiny if it should supplement its high, serrated surface by the plateaus and lowlands of Bolivia, as Cyrus the Persian married the plateau of Iran to the plains of the Tigris and Euphrates, and Romulus joined the Alban hills to the alluvial fields of the Tiber. Anthropo-Geography of lowlands. Well-watered lowlands invite expansion, ethnic, commercial and political. In them the whole range of historical movements meet few obstacles beyond the waters gathering in their runnels and the forests nourished in their rich soils. Limited to 200 meters (660 feet) elevation, lowlands develop no surface features beyond low hills and undulating swells of land. Uniformity of life conditions, monotony of climate as of relief, except where grades of latitude intervene to chill or heat, an absence of natural boundaries, and constant encouragement to intercourse, are the anthropo-geographic traits of lowlands, as opposed to the arresting, detaining grasp of mountains and highland valleys. Small, isolated lowlands, like the mountain-rimmed plains of Greece and the Aegean coast of Asia Minor, the Nile floodplain, Portugal, and Andalusia in Spain, may achieve precocious and short-lived historical importance, owing to the fertility of their alluvial soils, their character as naturally defined districts, and their advantageous maritime location. But while in these restricted lowlands the telling feature has been their barrier boundaries of desert, mountains and sea, the vast level plains of the earth have found their distinctive and lasting historical importance in the fact of their large and unbounded surface. Such plains have been both source and recipient of every form of historical movement. Owing to their prevailing fitness for agriculture, trade and intercourse, they are favored regions for the final massing of a sedentary population. The areas of greatest density of population in the world, harboring 150 or more to the square kilometer, 385 to the square mile, are found in the lowlands of China, the alluvial plains of India, and similar level stretches in the Neapolitan plain and Po Valley, the lowlands of France, Germany, Holland, Belgium, England and Scotland. Such a density is found in upland districts, 660 to 2,000 feet, or 200 to 600 meters, bordering agricultural lowlands, only where industries based upon mineral wealth cause a concentration of population. See maps pages 8, 9, 559. Extensive plains unfavorable to early development. The level or undulating surface of extensive lowlands is not favorable to the early development of civilization. Not only do their wide extent and absence of barriers postpone the transition from nomadism to sedentary life, but their lack of contrasting environments and contrasted developments, which supplement and stimulate, puts chains upon progress. A flat, monotonous relief produces a monotonous existence, necessarily one-sided, needing a complement in upland or mountain. To the pioneer settlers in the lowlands of Missouri, the Ozark Plateau was a boon, because its streams furnished water power for much-needed saw and flour mills. Treeless Egypt, even before 2500 BC, depended upon the cedars of the Lebanon mountains for the construction of its ships, so that the conquest of Lebanon, begun by Thutmose I and completed by Thutmose III, in about 1470 BC, had a sound geographical basis. 1033 Similarly, the exploitation of the copper, malachite, turquoise and lapis lazuli of Mount Sinai, minerals not found in the Nile plain, led the ancient Egyptians into extensive mining operations there before 3000 BC, and resulted in the establishment of Egyptian political supremacy in 2900 BC. As a measure to protect the mines against the depredations of the neighboring Bedouin tribes. 1034 Lowlands lacked the distinctive advantages of highlands found in diversity of climate, water power, generally in more abundant forests and minerals. The latter are earlier discovered and worked in the tilted strata of mountains and uplands. Plain countries suffer particularly from a paucity of varied geographic conditions and of resulting contrasts in their population. Their national characters tend to be less richly endowed, their possibilities for development are blighted or retarded, because even racial differences are rapidly obliterated in the uniform geographic environment. A small diversified country like Crete, Great Britain, Italy, Portugal, Saxony, or Japan, is a geographical multum in parvo. The western half of Europe bears the same stamp, endowing each country and nation with marked individuality born of partial isolation and a varied combination of environment. The larger eastern half of the continent embraced in the plains of Poland and Russia shows monotony in every aspect of human life. This comes out anthropologically in the striking similarity of headform found everywhere north and east of the Carpathian Mountains, except in the secluded districts of Lithuania and Crimea, which shelter remnants of distinct races. Over all this vast territory, the range of cephalic variation is only 5 units or 1/3 that in the restricted but diversified territory of Western Europe. Italy, only 1/18 the size of European Russia, has a range of 15 units, reflecting in the variety of its human types the diversity of its environment. 1035. Conditions for fusion in plains. In the plains, geography makes for fusion. Russia shows this marked homogeneity, despite a motley collection of race ingredients which have entered into the makeup of the Russian people. Without boundary or barrier, the country has stood wide open to invasion, but the intruders found no secluded corners where they could entrench themselves and preserve their national individuality. 1036 They dropped into a vast melting pot, which has succeeded in amalgamating the most diverse elements. The long-drawn Baltic North Sea plain of Europe shows the same power to fuse. Here is found a prevailing blonde, long-headed stock from the Gulf of Finland to the Saône River in France. 1037 Yet this natural boulevard has been a passway for races. Prehistoric evidences show that the dark, broad-headed Celtic folk once overspread this plain east to the Weser. 1038 It still tends to trickle down from the southern uplands into the Baltic lowland, and modify the Teutonic type along its southern margin throughout Germany. 1039 The Slavs in historic times reached as far west as the Weser, while the expansion of the Teutons has embraced the whole maritime plain from Brittany to the Finnish Gulf. Here it is difficult to draw an ethnic boundary on the basis of physical differences. The Eastern Prussians are Slavonized Teutons, and the adjacent Poles seem to be Teutonized Slavs, while the purest type of Leto-Lithuanian at the eastern corner of the Baltic coast approximates closely to the Anglo-Saxon type which sprang from the western corner. 1040 A similar amalgamation of races and peoples has taken place in the lowlands of England and Scotland, while diversity still lingers in the highlands. In the lowlands of Scotland, Picts in small numbers, Britons, Scots from Ireland, Angles, Frisians, Northmen and Danes have all been blended and assimilated in habits, customs and speech. 1041 Retardation due to monotonous environment. This uniformity is advantageous to early development in a small plain, because of the juxtaposition of contrasted environments, but is stultifying to national life in an immense expanse of monotony like that of Russia. Here sameness leaves its stamp on everything. Language is differentiated with only two dialects, that of the Great Russians of the north and the Little Russians of the southern steppes, who were so long exposed to Tartar influences. Most other languages of Europe, though confined to much smaller areas, show far greater diversity. 1042 While the Russian of Kazan or Archangel can converse readily with the citizen of Riga or St. Petersburg, Germans from Highland Bavaria and Swabia are scarcely intelligible to Prussian in Mecklenburger. And whereas Germany a few decades ago could count over 100 different kinds of national dress or tract, Great Russia alone, with 6 times the area, had only a single type with perhaps a dozen slight variations. Leroy Beaulieu comments upon this eternal sameness. The cities are all alike, so are the peasants, in looks, habits, in mode of life. In no country do people resemble one another more, no other country is so free from political complexity, those oppositions in type and character, which even yet we encounter in Italy and Spain, in France and Germany. The nation is made in the likeness of the country, it shows the same unity, we might say the same monotony, as the plains on which it dwells. Influence of soils in low plains. The more flat and featureless a lowland is, the more important become even the slightest surface irregularities which can draw faint dividing lines among the population. Here a gentle landswell, river, lake, forest, or water-soaked moor serves as boundary. Especially apparent is the differentiating influence of difference of soils. Gravel and alluvium, sand and clay, chalk and more recent marine sediments emphasize small geographical differences throughout the North German lowland and its extension through Belgium and Holland. Here various soils differentiate the distribution of population. In the Netherlands we find the Frisian element of the Dutch people inhabiting chiefly the clay soils and low fens of the west and northwest, the Saxon in the diluvial tracts of the east, and the Frankish in the river clays and diluvium of the south. All the types have maintained their differences of dialect, styles of houses, racial character, dress and custom. 1043 The only distinctive region in the great western lowland of France, which comprises over half of the country, is Brittany, individualized in its people and history by its peninsula form, its remote western location, and its infertile soil of primary rocks. Within the sedimentary trough of the Paris Basin, a slight Cretacean platform like the meadowland of Perchy 1044, 200 to 300 meters elevation, introduces an area of thin population devoted to horse and cattle raising in close proximity to the teeming urban life of Paris. The eastern lowland of England also can be differentiated economically and historically chiefly according to differences of underlying rocks, Carboniferous, Triassic, Jurassic, chalk, boulder clays, and alluvium, which also coincide often with slight variations of relief. 1045 In Russia the contrast between the glaciated surface of the north and the black mold belt of the south makes the only natural divisions of that vast country, unless we distinguish also the arid southeastern steppes on the basis of a purely climatic difference. See map page 484. The broad coastal plain of our South Atlantic states contains only low reliefs, but it is diversified by several soil belts, which exert a definite control over the industries of the inhabitants, and thereby over the distribution of the Negro population. In Georgia, for instance, the rich alluvial soil of the swampy coast is devoted to the culture of rice and sea island cotton, and contains over 60% of Negroes in its population. This belt, which is only 25 miles wide, is succeeded inland by a broader zone of sandy pine barrens, where the proportion of Negroes drops to only 20 or 30% of the total. Yet further inland is another fertile belt, devoted chiefly to the cultivation of upland cotton and harboring from 35 to over 60% of Negroes in its population. 1046 Alabama shows a similar stratification of soils and population from north to south over its level surface. Along the northern border of the state, the cereal belt coincides with the deep calcareous soil of the Tennessee River Valley, where Negroes constitute from 35 to 60% of the inhabitants. Next comes the mineral belt, covering the low foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. It contains the densest population of the state, less than 17% of which is Negro. South of this is the broad cotton belt of various rich soils, chiefly deep black loam of the river bottoms, which stretches east and west across the state and includes over 60% of Negroes in its population. This is succeeded by the low, coastal timber belt, marked by a decline in the quality of the soil and the proportion of Negro inhabitants. 1047. Value of slight elevations. In the dead level of extensive plains, even slight elevations are seized upon for special uses, or acquire peculiar significance. The kurgans or burial mounds of the prehistoric inhabitants of Russia, often 20 to 50 feet high, serve today as watchtowers for herdsmen tending their flocks. 1048. Similarly, the Bubus, inhabiting the flat grasslands of the French Congo between the Sherry and Ubangui rivers, use the low knolls dotted over their country, probably old ant hills, as lookout points against raiders. 1049. The sandhills and ridges which border the southern edges of the North German lowland form districts, sharply contrasted to the swampy, wooded depressions of the old deserted river valleys just to the north. Early occupied by a German stock, they furnished the first German colonists to displace the primitive Slav population surviving in those unattractive, inaccessible regions, as seen in the Spreewald near Cottbus today. Plains and political expansion. The boundless horizon, which is unfavorable to a nascent people, endows them in their belated maturity with the power of mastering large areas. Political expansion is the dominant characteristic of the peoples of the plains. Haxthausen observed that handicapped and retarded Russia commands every geographic condition and national trait necessary for virile and expansive political power. 1050 Muscovite expansion eastward across the lowlands of Europe and Asia is paralleled by the rapid spread of American settlement and dominion across the plains and prairies of the Mississippi Valley, and Hungarian domination of the wide Danubian levels from the foothills of the Austrian Alps to the far Carpathian watershed. It was the closely linked lowlands of the Seine and Loire which formed the core of political expansion and centralization in France. Nearly the whole northern lowland of Germany has been gradually absorbed by the Kingdom of Prussia, which now comprises in its territory almost two-thirds of the total area of the empire. Prussian statesmen formulated the policy of German unification and colonial expansion, and to Prussia fell the hereditary headship of the empire. Lowland states tend to stretch out and out to boundaries which depend more upon the reach of the central authority than upon physical features. We have seen American settlement and dominion overleap one natural boundary after another between the Mississippi River and the Pacific, from 1804 to 1848. Russia in an equally short period has pushed forward its Asiatic frontier at a dozen points, despite all barriers of desert and mountain. Argentina, blessed with extensive plains, fertile soil and temperate climate, which have served to augment its population both by natural increase and steady immigration, 1/4 of its population is foreign, has expanded across the Rio Negro over the grasslands of the Patagonian plain, and thereby enlarged its area by 259,620 square miles since 1881. The statesman of the plains is a nature-made imperialist. He nurses wide territorial policies and draws his frontiers for the future. To him, a far-flung battle line is significant only as a means to secure a far-flung boundary line. Arid plains. From these low, accessible plains of adequate rainfall, which at first encourage primitive nomadism but finally make it yield to sedentary life and to dense populations spreading their farms and cities farther and farther over the unresisting surface of the land, we turn to those boundless arid steppes and deserts which nature has made forever the homes of restless, rootless peoples. Here quiescence is impossible, The Völkerwanderung is habitual, migration is permanent. The only change is this eternal restlessness. While the people move, progress stands still. Everywhere the sun-scorched grasslands and waterless waste have drawn the deadline to the advance of indigenous civilization. They permit no accumulation of productive wealth beyond increasing flocks and herds, and limit even their growth by the food supply of scanty, scattered pasturage. The meager rainfall eliminates forests and therewith a barrier to migrations. It also restricts vegetation to grasses, sedges, and those forms which can survive a prolonged summer drought and require a short period of growth. Annual rainfall of the world. Annual rainfall of the world. Distribution and extent of arid plains. The union of arid plains and steppe vegetation is based upon climate, and is therefore a widely distributed phenomenon. These plains, whether high or low, are found in their greatest extent in the dry trade wind belts, as in the deserts and steppes of Arabia, Persia, Sudan, the Sahara, South Africa, and Central Australia, and in vast continental interiors, where the winds arrive robbed of their moisture in passing intervening highlands, as in the grasslands of our western plains, the llanos and pampas of South America, and the steppes of Central Asia. But wherever they occur, whether in Argentina or Russian Turkestan or the higher plains of Mongolia and Tibet, they present the same general characteristics of land surface, climate, flora and fauna, and the same nomadic populations of pastoral or hunting tribes. In them the movement of peoples reaches its culminating point, permanent settlement its nil point. Here the hunting savage makes the widest sweep in pursuit of buffalo or antelope, and pauses least to till a field. Here the pastoral nomad follows his systematic wandering in search of pasturage and his hardly less systematic campaigns of conquest. It is the vast area and wide distribution of these arid plains, combined with the mobility which they impose on native human life, that has lent them historical importance, and reproduced in all sections of the world that significant homologous relation of arid and well-watered districts. Pastoral life. The grasslands of the Old World developed historical importance only after the domestication of cattle, sheep, goats, asses, horses, camels, and yaks. This step in progress resulted in the evolution of peoples who renounced the precarious subsistence of the chase and escaped the drudgery of agriculture, to devote themselves to pastoral life. It was possible only where domesticable animals were present, and where the intelligence of the native or the peculiar pressure exerted by environment suggested the change from a natural to an artificial basis of subsistence. Australia lacked the type of animal. Though North America had the reindeer and buffalo, and South America the guanaco, llama, and alpaca, only the last two were domesticated in the Andean highlands, but as these were restricted to altitudes from 10,000 to 14,000 feet, where pasturage was limited, stock raising in primitive South America was merely an adjunct to the sedentary agriculture of the high intermontane valleys, and never became the basis for pastoral nomadism on the grassy plains. However, when the Spaniards introduced horses and cattle into South America, the Indians and half-breeds of the llanos and pampas became regular pastoral nomads, known as llaneros and gauchos. They are a race of horsemen, wielding javelin and lasso and bola, living on meat, often on horseflesh like the ancient Huns, dwelling in leather tents made on a cane framework, like those of the modern Kyrgyz and medieval Tartars, dressed in cloaks of horsehide sewn together, and raiding the Argentinian frontier of white settlement for horses, sheep, and cattle, with the true marauding instinct of all nomads. 1051. Pastoral nomads of Arctic plains. Aridity is not the only climatic condition condemning a people to nomadic life. Excessive cold, producing the tundra wastes of the far north, has the same effect. Therefore, throughout Arctic Eurasia, from the Lapp district of Norway to the inland Chukchas of eastern Siberia, we have a succession of Hyperborean peoples pasturing their herds of reindeer over the moss and lichen tundra, and supplementing their food supply with hunting and fishing. The reindeer Chukchas once confined themselves to their peninsula, so long as the grazing grounds were unexhausted, but they now range as far west as Yakutsk on the Lena River. The Orokones of the Kolyma River district in eastern Siberia, who live chiefly by their reindeer, have small herds. A well-to-do person will have 40 to 100 animals, and the wealthiest only 700, while the Chukchas with herds of 10,000 often seek the pasture of the Kolyma tundra. 1052 farther west, the Samoyeds of northern Siberia and Russia and the Zirians of the Petchora River range with their large herds northward to the Yelmal Peninsula and Vagatsal in summer, and southward in winter. See map pages 103-225. Here a herd of 50 head, which just suffices for the support of one family of 4 souls, requires 10 square versts, or 4.44 square miles of tundra pasturage. 1053 Hence population must forever remain too sparse ever to attain historical significance. See map page 8. The Russian Lapps, too, lead a semi-nomadic life. Each group has a particular summer and winter settlement. The winter village is located usually inland in the Kola Peninsula, where the forests lend shelter to the herds, and the summer one near the tundra of the coast, where fishing is accessible. In winter, like the nomads of the deserts, they add to their slender income by the transport of goods by their reindeer and by service at the post stations. 1054. Historical importance of steppe nomads. These nomads of the frozen north, scattered sparsely over the remote periphery of the habitable world, have lacked the historical importance which in all times has attached to the steppe nomads, owing to their central location. The broad belt of deserts and grasslands which crosses the Old World diagonally between 10 degrees and 60 degrees north latitude from the Atlantic in Africa to the Pacific in Asia, either borders or encompasses the old domains of culture found in river oases, alluvial lowlands or coastal plains of the torrid and temperate zones. The restless, mobile, unbound shepherds of the arid lands have never long been contained by the country which bred them. They have constantly encroached upon the territory of their better-placed neighbors, invading, conquering, appropriating their fields and cities, disturbing but at the same time acquiring their culture, lording it over the passive agriculturists, and at the same time putting iron into their weaker blood. It is the geographical contact between arid steppes and moist river valley, between land of poverty and land of plenty, that has made the history of the two inseparable. 1055. Cultural regions of Africa and Arabia. Cultural regions of Africa and Arabia. Mobility of pastoral nomads. Every aspect of human life in the steppes bears the stamp of mobility. The nomad tolerates no clog upon his movements. His dwelling is the tent of skin or felt as among Kalmucks and Kyrgyz, or the tent wagon of the modern Boer. 1056 and the ancient Scythian is described by Herodotus. 1057 This device has been contrived by them as the country is fit for it, he says, level, grassy, treeless. The temporary settlement of shepherd tribes is the group of tents, or the ancient Karago camp of the nomadic Visigoths, 1058 or the laager of the pastoral Boers, both a circular barricade or corral of wagons. Tendency to trek. Constant movement reduces the impedimenta to a minimum. The Orokones, a Tungus nomadic tribe of eastern Siberia, have no furniture in their tents, and keep their meager supply of clothing and utensils neatly packed on sledges, as if to start at a moment's notice. 1059 The only desirable form of capital is that which transports itself, namely, flocks and herds. Beyond that, wealth is limited to strictly portable forms, preferably silver, gold and jewels. It was in terms of these, besides their herds, that the riches of Abraham and Lot were rated in the Bible. That the Israelites when traveling through the wilderness should have had the gold to make the golden calf accords strictly with the verisimilitude of pastoral life. 1060 Moreover, that these enslaved descendants of the Sheikh Abraham, with their traditions of pastoral life, should have simply ruptured the frail ties of recently acquired habit which bound them to the Nile soil, is also in keeping with their inborn nomadic spirit. Similar instances occur among modern peoples. The Great Trek of the South African Boers in 1836, by which they renounced not only their unwelcome allegiance to England, but also their land. 1061 was another exodus in accordance with the instinct of a pastoral people. They adopted no strange or difficult course, but traveled with their families as they were wont in their everyday life of cattle tenders, took all their chattels with them, and headed for the thin pastures of the far-reaching veldt. The Russian government has had to contend with a like fluidity in her Cossack tribes of the steppes, who have been up and off when imperial authority became oppressive. In the summer of 1878, West Siberia lost about 9,000 Kyrgyz, who left the province Semipalatinsk to seek Mongolia. Seasonal migrations. Environment determines the nomadic habits of the dweller of desert and steppe. The distribution of pasture and water fixes the scope and the rate of his wandering. These in turn depend upon geographic conditions and vary with the season. The Papago Indians of southern Arizona range with their cattle over a territory 100 by 150 miles in extent, and wander across the border into Mexico. When their main water supply, derived from wells or artificial reservoirs near their summer villages, is exhausted, they migrate to the waterholes, springs, or streams in the canyons. There the cattle graze out on the plains and return to the canyons to drink. 1062 Every Mongol tribe and clan has its seasonal migration. In winter, the heavier precipitation and fuller streams enable them to collect in considerable groups in protected valleys, but the dry summer disperses them over the widest area possible, in order to utilize every waterhole and grass spot. The hotter regions of the plains are abandoned in summer for highlands, where the short period of warmth yields temporary pastures and where alone water can be found. The Kyrgyz of Russian Turkestan resort in summer to the slopes and high valleys of the Altai Mountains, where their hulls or tent villages may be seen surrounded by big flocks of sheep, goats, camels, horses, and cattle. 1063 The Pamir in the warm months is the gathering place for the nomads of Central Asia. The naked desert of Arabia yields a rare herbage during the rainy season, when the Bedouin tribes resort to it for pasturage. 1064 But during the succeeding drought they scatter to the hills of Yemen, Syria, and Palestine. 1065 Or migrate to the valley of the Nile and Euphrates. 1066 The Arabs of the northern Sahara, followed by small flocks of sheep and goats, vibrate between the summer pastures on the slopes of the Atlas Mountains and the scant, wiry grass tufts found in winter on the borders of the desert. 1067 When the equatorial rains begin in June, the Arabs of the Atbara River follow them northwestward into the Nubian desert, and let their camel herds graze on the delicate grass which the moisture has conjured up from the sandy soil. The country about Kassala, which is flooded during the monsoon rains by the rivers from the Abyssinian mountains, is reserved for the dry season. 1068 In the same way the Tartar tribes of the Dnieper, Don, Volga, and Ural rivers in the 13th century moved down these rivers in winter to the seacoast, and in summer upstream to the hills and mountains. 1069 So for the past 100 years the boers of the South African grasslands have migrated in their tent wagons from the higher to the lower pastures, according to the season of the year, invading even the Karoo Desert after the short summer rains. 1070 Marauding expeditions. This systematic movement of nomads within their accepted boundaries leads, on slight provocation, to excursions beyond their own frontiers into neighboring territories. The growing herd alone necessitates the absorption of more land, more waterholes, because the grazed pastures renew their grass slowly under the prevailing conditions of drought. An area sufficient for the support of the tribe is inadequate for the sustenance of the herd, whose increase is a perennial expansive force. Soon the pastures become filled with the feeding flocks, and then herdsmen and herds spill over into other fields. Often a season of unusual drought, reducing the existing herbage which is scarcely adequate at best, gives rise to those irregular, temporary expansions which enlarge the geographical horizon of the horde, and eventuate in widespread conquest. Such incursions, like the seasonal movements of nomads, result from the helpless dependence of shepherd tribes upon variations of rainfall. The nomad's basis of life is at best precarious. He and want are familiar friends. A pest among his herds, diminished pasturage, failing wells, all bring him face to face with famine, and drive him to robbery and pillage. 1071 Marauding tendencies are ingrained in all dwellers of the deserts and steppes. 1072 Since the days of Job, the Bedouins of Arabia have been a race of marauders. They have reduced robbery to a system. Predatory excursions figure conspicuously in the history of all the tribes. Robber is a title of honor. 1073 Pliny said that the Arabs were equally addicted to theft in trade. They pillaged caravans and held them for ransom, or gave them safe conduct across the desert for a price. Formerly, the Turkoman tribes of the Trans-Caspian steppes levied on the bordering districts, notably the northern part of Khorasan, which belonged more to the Turkomans, Yomut and Goklan tribes of the adjoining steppe than to the resident Persians. The border districts of Herat, Khiva, Merv and Bokhara used to suffer in the same way from the raids of the Turks, till the Russians checked the evil. 1070 For the Turks had depopulated whole districts, invaded Persian towns of considerable size, and carried off countless families into slavery. Both Turkomans and Kyrgyz tribes prior to 1873 raided caravans and carried off the travelers to the slave markets of Bokhara and Samarkand. 1075, see map page 103. Among these tribes no young man commanded respect in his community till he had participated in a baranta or cattle raising. 1076 For centuries the nomadic hordes of the Russian steppes systematically pillaged the peaceful agricultural Slavs, who were threatening to encroach upon their pasture lands. The sudden, swift descent and swift retreat of the mounted marauders with the booty into the pathless grasslands, whither pursuit was dangerous, their tendency to rob and conquer but never to colonize, involved Russia in a long struggle, which ceased only with the extension of Muscovite dominion over the steppes. 1077.